We want to take just a short minute for Dr. Patton to say a few words. She is our city manager, for those of you that may not be familiar with her. And the floor is all yours.
Thank you so very much, Mrs. Burton, and good morning to all of you. And hope that you're having a great week. And before I share what I came to share, I must recognize Landon Moore. I have not seen him since soccer days at Churchland Soccer Field, and I would say it was probably our day, and you all were on a team when you were 10. And I know that's many, many years later, but I didn't get to say anything to him when he received his pin during the last city council meeting. So we are indeed excited to have you as a new part of our retirement board. But I came this morning to share that I accepted the resignation of our former chief financial advisor, Mrs. Alice Kelly. And in the interim, I appointed Mrs. Barbara Dameron. Mrs. Dameron came to our area from Danville as Director of Finance because she had a sister that is ill. And her sister lives in Newport News, and there is quite a drive from where she lives in Newport News to get to Portsmouth every day. At the same time she applied for Portsmouth Assistant CFO, she applied with the City of Williamsburg. And on last week, the City of Williamsburg offered Mrs. Dameron the Director of Finance position, of which she will start March 1st. And it puts her very close to her sister. And on Monday when she came in, she said, now I realize that I really made the right decision because my sister needs me. And with any of us, we know how important family is, and we want her to be there for her sister. At that point, about a week and a half ago, working with HR, we put out a national search with the Maxwell Group for a new chief financial officer, which we are already receiving applications from across the country and within the region. In the interim now, I am here to welcome Mrs. Seward, Ann Seward, who comes to us, and some of you may know Ann Seward because she has been in Hampton Roads and a part of municipal government for a long time. Mrs. Seward has a Bachelor's of Science degree in Business Administration and Accounting, and she, in her professional background, includes serving as County Administrator for Isle of Wight County. She was Chief Financial Officer for the City of Suffolk. She was Assistant County Administrator and Director of Budget and Finance for Isle of Wight County, and Senior Audit for the Commonwealth of Virginia Auditor for Public Accounts. To fill in the gap, and that's what we are actually defining it as, Mrs. Seward will be with us. We are looking to have a new Chief Financial Officer on board by the mid of April and definitely before the end of May. And that is the time frame that Mrs. Ann Seward would be with us. So I wanted to introduce her to this very important board and let you know that she has all of the skills and abilities and experience to continue to work with us as we move forward with financial security in this city. So thank you all so much, and I'm not going to interrupt your meeting any further, and have a great week. Thank you. Thank you.
Always nice to see you. Thank you.
Thank
and you're
you so
welcome
much.
anytime.
I shall. Okay. Bye-bye.
All right. Sheriff Waters, I think, had to take a phone call, but let's go ahead. Quickly, has everybody had a chance to review the minutes?
Let me call the roll.
Oh, sorry. Jumping right ahead.
You are. You're just ready to go.
That notification on stupid phone.
Sue Burton?
Here.
Laura Bellin? Matthew Crutcher? David Harrington? Landon Moore?
I'm here.
Mark Munson?
Here.
Gary Waters?
Here.
Libby Gooden?
Here.
Barbara Dameron?
Here.
Solomon Ashby?
Not here.
Okay. Derek Challenger?
Present.
And Ann Seward?
Here.
You do have quorum.
All right, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
Now, has everybody had an opportunity to look at the minutes, and were there any additions, corrections, or can I have a motion to approve?
I make a motion to approve.
Second.
Second, all those in favor?
Aye. Aye.
None opposed. All right, thank you very much. I believe we have some applications for retirement.
Yes, we do. First one is for Paige Cherry in the Portsmouth Retirement System. Former city councilman. He is now our city treasurer. You can see the numbers. In fire and police, we have Kimberly Wilson, assistant police chief, is retiring. And reported deaths, we have Irvin Johnson out of the PRS system. Joe Straight out of the PRS system with a 50% spousal annuity. And Peggy King out of Fire and Police. Active participants as of February 1st, Fire and Police 19, Portsmouth Supplemental System 17.
Numbers going down. All right, any questions? All right, the recurring business report, the schedule of historic funds flow, please.
Year-to-date, as of December 31st, started the year with a beginning balance of $230,630,954.83. We had interest income, $3,984,429.56. Administrative expenses of $101,399.93. We have had return of benefit payments, $17,244.85. Recurring benefit payments of $14,900,448.85. Employer contributions, $2,772,251.68. Realized gain of $1,353,172.20. Unrealized gain of $7,595,189.75. That is a net change to the positive of $720,439.26, leaving us with an ending balance of $231,351,394.09. We are better, as of this point last year, we're better by $5,430,889.22.
Great.
And yes, I did double check that.
Any questions? All right. Let's move on. I believe this is this when we need to ask our gentleman to
Yes.
leave the room
Sure.
briefly while we discuss some RFP, et cetera, issues? Thank you.
Sure. Very well.
Mr. Young, that'll be you too. Right. A report from the investment committee.
Sure. We met, and I think the only one other person in the room besides Gail is Mr. Moore that was in attendance that day. And a couple of things we discussed, excuse me, my voice wants to crackle a little bit when I first start talking. But one of the things that we discussed was the status of the RFP. So part of that discussion centered on whether or not we wanted to go through that process again, because the responses that we received are somewhat dated, and we have new members on our board. Another, or on the committee, another part of the discussion also focused on discretionary versus non-discretionary. So the proposals that we received addressed non-discretionary only. as part of that, we felt that we needed to come back to the board, have a discussion on non-discretionary versus discretionary. But I believe, and correct me if I'm mistaken, that the consensus on the board, regardless of this decision on non-discretionary versus discretionary, would be that we go back out through the RFP process, and that we consider opening that up to discretionary or non-discretionary, either one or both, because you may have some vendors that would offer both. But at the same time, we thought it would be good to go through a brief presentation just to address both methodologies. And so Mr. Moore participated in us drafting the slides, and I'd like for him, I'll start us off if that's okay, but we've discussed this, and I would like for him to chime in and help with the presentation. My background has been working with non-discretionary. He has a background in working with discretionary. I'll just start off by saying there's no right or wrong answer. One's not right and one's not wrong, but it's what's best for these pension funds and what this board's comfortable with. And I think it's probably good we have some exposure either way in the discussion, because he's going to bring out points about discretionary and I'm going to bring out points about non-discretionary, because that's what I'm familiar with. But I just want to make it clear. What is important is that you make an informed decision, okay? So the first thing that we did is define what discretionary is and non-discretionary. I'm not going to read that to you. I'm going to talk from my view, and welcome Mr. Moore coming in with his comments. But I view discretionary is this board or the investment committee would consider a discretionary manager. Once that manager is hired and they are familiar with our policies, they've reviewed the parameters of which we want to make investments, and this board's tolerance for risk, they're going to go hire managers. You will still have, and it will be important that you still review the performance of the funds. But when they decide that someone needs to be terminated and maybe funds shifted into a different investment, they're not going to come back to this board and say, you know, we've been watching this investment manager, we're not satisfied with performance. Our recommendation would be that you terminate them, and then that you look at other avenues to invest that money. You're not going to have that. They're just going to do it. Whereas with a non-discretionary, which is often referred to as an advisory service, they'll come in, they'll review the financials, they'll say, you know, let's put this company on watch. Let's put this manager on watch. And then they may come back and say, well, I think you should consider terminating them. And you'll take a vote, but they can't terminate them until you give your approval. Then you might say to them, we would like for you to come back to this board with some investment managers that we might consider, or I should say the investment committee. And the investment committee then they'll come back with 3, and typically that advisor is going to bring in 3 that he is comfortable with any 3 that's selected. But the investment committee would then interview them, listen to them, and say, well, you know, we like this approach or this manager over the other 2. We think we should go with them. The investment committee would come back to the board and say, this is our recommendation. The board could choose to just go with that, or say we'd like to have them come in and present to us. But the bottom line is they're going to advise and give you advice on what they're seeing in the market, and they're going to do the research on the managers, but they can't do anything without this board's approval. Where with discretionary, you are responsible for hiring that manager and determining if you want to stay with them. So Landon, let me pause a minute and let you add any.
So I agree with all of that, and it really is, the division of the responsibilities shift a little bit more to the portfolio manager and investment manager, and that line really an important part is the hiring and firing of managers without the board consent. They're operating inside the investment policy that the board has approved, and as long as they're inside those guidelines that we've laid out, the investment manager could move money and or hire, fire, negotiate with investment managers. And you are going to pay a little bit more for that. They're off doing more for us, so you pay more. But the balance there is that yes, you're paying more. You're freeing up some city resources of doing some of the administration and work behind the scenes. You're outsourcing that to the investment manager. You're paying more for it, but hopefully what you would gain for that is they can make decisions quicker and move money to take advantage of any market timing and disruptions in the market. Hopefully the manager, being a professional investment manager, has resources and access to more people and data than the city, and could do a better job at that. That would be the argument. You're paying more, but hopefully they could do it better than the city could do it if we're just we were doing it ourselves. With that being said, you would at any time be able to, if you don't like what they're doing, the board can always terminate the contract and change. Although you don't, obviously you wouldn't want that to happen. So it is, as Barbara said, there's no right way or wrong way. You can be successful either way. It's really a decision, and I thought it was important to think about this again, especially with personnel in the staff changing. Maybe new CFO doesn't want to deal with it and use their staff resources to manage the pension and concentrate on other things. I don't know, but I think when the RFPs come back and you see the difference in the proposals for the fees and the services, it'll become clear which one will make sense. But with that being said, we thought
We'll add, either way, you still have a fiduciary responsibility.
I can actually comment. I've had about 2 weeks to reflect on the same issue. The context being, I'm also just got named to the school board's other post-employment benefit trust, and they are going through the same discussion right now. And so I've had a chance to think about that. I personally come down on the side of, in the situation that we are in, if we were to take the position as we have in the past, where we are the ones that are going to pull the trigger, we have the final decision, that lays a lot of responsibility on each and every board member to do their research into the proposed fund managers, into the timing of the decisions. And I am not sure that we can expect that on a continuing basis we would be able to keep that level of expertise on the committee. And I've actually seen a proposal where I saw the difference from the same company between a discretionary and non-discretionary. That said, I think it might be important for us to see that difference. Right. So I might suggest that we ask that an RFP go out, and we make it a value-based proposition, a value-based RFP, and we ask whoever submits to submit in both ways. Give us a proposal where, under the discretionary model. Give us a proposal under the non-discretionary model that the committee can consider.
The only thing I would say to that is I would consider either or both, and the reason for that, you're going to have some firms that absolutely are not interested in doing non-discretionary. and you're going to have some firms that are not interested in doing discretionary,
I can
and
go
they're
with that.
great.
Absolutely.
But I think
That's
you
fine.
do need to compare both. I would agree with
An
that. That's an
RFP
informed
that
decision.
would allow either to happen and make it clear that then we will be making a value-based decision. Gives us a little more flexibility in evaluating the proposals.
Haven't we pretty much been on a discretionary basis up to this point? Is that my understanding? That we've allowed the firm to pretty much manage?
Pretty much.
I mean, they check in.
Yeah, they let us know if there's a manager that they think we need to switch. They say, these are the ones we think you should switch to. This is what we think. And so they don't just come in and say, oh, by the way, we took it out of Templeton and put it into. But they...
And then I don't have as long a history here. I do know that initially, before Greystone got involved, you basically were the person managing that was more of somebody I might sit down across the table with as an individual. They didn't really have the skill set for institutional investment.
Right.
And then Greystone stepped up to the plate, but you really don't have a formal contract, if you will, with them. So that's a concern. And I also wanted to note there's a bit of a difference, I think, in having an advisor who's coming in and kind of leading, guiding, and doing the actual research, but then once you're responsible for taking that research they've done and listening to the investment managers. Versus, say, somewhere like for instance, VRS, they do a lot of their own in-house. They don't necessarily hire an advisor because they have a staff that's knowledgeable to do what we're hiring for.
Right.
So just some little bit of differences there, but we do have a few more slides.
I guess if, Greystone or another advisor is coming in here and making a recommendation for a change, if the board doesn't have professional investment experience, who are we to say yes or no or one way or the other? If we're always deferring to what the advisor says, why not just let them do it?
Right, I agree with that.
Yes.
That's why we hire them.
I think that's where we'll end up.
Yeah.
Yes.
But again, let's look at both, and the fees and the proposal, I think, will make that an easier decision.
Sure, I didn't skip a slide.
I threw this in here to lay out, and it's printed on the back of the page, but one of these is the division of roles and responsibilities for the discretionary relationship versus the non-discretionary. And basically, under the discretionary, non-discretionary relationship, so let me just make sure I'm looking at this right. Okay, so I'm not going to go through every one, but in the non-discretionary relationship, you see there the second row, managing the investment committee, actually deciding on the manager selection. The board really is only oversight of that, whereas in the discretionary.
Want me to roll to the next? I think we've got.
Actually, for me, if you keep one up on the board and I can look at the other in my hand.
Oh yeah, that was.
Okay, we'll keep
Almost
this
need
one
a
up and you can look at the
juxtaposition
other.
of the two.
Sure.
Sorry, I'm big on saving paper, so I do front and back.
That's quite all right.
So
Could have put 2 slides on 1 page.
But then it would have been too small for some of us to be able to read.
So the in the discretionary relationship where the investment manager, portfolio manager has more responsibility, the board really is just oversight, setting the investment policy, monitoring their performance, and that's really it. Under the discretionary, the board has to make decisions from time to time about moving money between investment managers and hiring, firing investment managers. And it's basically, do you want those decisions to be always answered at the board rather than that going to the investment manager? So
And
you
then-
have.
Oh, go ahead. Well, and then we threw up some comparisons of pros and cons. And so one of the pros about discretionary it saves time. You're not using staff resources. And not only that, if it's a decision that needs to be made quick, they don't have to come back to the board. And then a con would be you're giving up some of the control to the investment manager, and you're going to have higher fees. They're doing more work. With the non-discretionary, you still have that say. And quite frankly, a lot of board members like having that education that you get from having the investment managers in. That's part of what makes it engaging and challenging for them. And I will tell you that I've seen two things. I can speak personally and both from other board members. So from a personal standpoint, in Danville, when I moved from deputy finance director to finance director, I had limited exposure to investing and overseeing the pension fund, and I was kind of, don't know. And part of that process really helped get me educated and very familiar with what are the things I need to look at. Likewise, we had we always had 3 employee members of the board, and we actually had elections, so it was a big deal for the employees. And oftentimes you get somebody new on, and then they come to me and they'd say, well, I was really excited to serve. I don't know a lot. And I would say, I'd sit down with them and give them an update, but I'd also say, don't worry about it too much, because when you start attending the meetings and working with the advisor and they'll work with you through how they look at things and why somebody might need to be terminated, which can range from performance to they had a change in management at the top and we don't think it's good. You're going to learn a lot. And typically by the end of a year or so, they come back and say, you're right, because starting out, I just was not comfortable, and now I'm so much more comfortable. And then, of course, the con on that side is, and let me make it clear from my perspective, when we say staff time, we're still going to have to look and stay on top of performance. It really comes down to when you're changing investment managers, you need to send out a notice that I'm terminating you. You need to then coordinate with the advisor in bringing in the different managers. And at the time that the board makes a decision, you need to fill out some forms that say, we're putting this much money here, and you need to work with the advisor to make sure that you understand the terms and it's completed correctly. But it does take some staff time, whereas in discretionary, they're just doing the whole thing. And then again, just the slower pace, that when they see a need to move, they're going to have to come back and get board approval. And that can, and I'm not sure whether you have anything prohibiting this, but as long as there's nothing in your bylaws or policies that prohibit it, that can be at a meeting, or it could be, a conference stand call, or it could be by email approval. And generally what I've experienced is typically they have typically you've put a manager on watch. So anything else that you?
No.
Pros, cons, pretty much laid out there. So in summary, just want to stress that either way you go, you still maintain a fiduciary duty. You can't get rid of that duty. And either way, you need to understand your goals and your appetite for risk. How much risk are you comfortable with? You still need to review the performance. You don't ever get away for that. It's just in one, you're looking whether I'm going to hire or fire a manager. The other, you're looking at how well is this discretionary manager doing? Do we think he's doing his job based on what we're reviewing? It's important that you be aware of the pros and cons of each approach, and you know exactly what you're getting into before you sign on the dotted line. And the only other comments I make is just, if you go with discretionary, you need to be careful of proprietary products, Because oftentimes they'll say, we're bringing you in. They're often very expensive products, but they'll say, well, since we're bringing you in, we're going to give you a discount. And as Landon mentioned down the road, if you decide this isn't the structure you want, you can change that. You can go out with another proposal and go back. But some of the discretionary or proprietary products, if you bought into them, could take a little time to get out of. Like emerging market and different things, it's not something you can do. It may take you years to get out of them. So I just caution that. And the other point I would make, you are going to pay a discretionary manager more because they're doing more. So typically, and you'll see this with RFPs if you go out with both, but typically a non-discretionary is going to range 2 to 3 basis points, or 2 to 5 basis points, where a discretionary is going to range somewhere between 35 and 50. So just to give you an idea of the magnitude, if I take a middle road, say 3 basis points for non-discretionary, and the lower end for discretionary, which would be 35 basis points on $250 million, you're talking about $700,000. So just to give you a feel of what you might expect to see, but as Mr. Munson pointed out, you can then compare the cost with the services.
Right. What I saw at this last meeting was they actually ran a parallel comparison. Here's, they are currently in a non-discretionary model, and so we have the actual, and they took the same investment over the same period of time that they would have run in their discretionary model, and with the puts and takes, it was basically a break even. So that at least that's one data point. And the only other thing I would say is it probably doesn't need to be said. It's probably in the contract language already. But just like a personal financial advisor, that we must have a requirement in there that the manager is required to place our financial interests above their own.
Actually, one thing that I always look at on proposals is, are they getting any kickback? And what I want to see is there's no kickback. There's no reason for you to recommend that I go with one manager over the other. I want to know that the only income they're getting are from their fees for advising. That's it.
Yep.
And that's one thing I would leave this board with, regardless of how you or what method you use, that you make sure that they make their income off the fees that they're getting from their clients and not any kickback from any investments.
To sort of further the discussion, and it may end up being something that we correct in our bylaws. Does anybody ever look at the possibility of just having the investment committee, who are supposed to be the people who are more knowledgeable in all of that, and then they report to the board decisions or discussion?
We have the investment committee determine I would hardly, if I was a VRS in a really big city and I had lots of money to pay for expertise, I would consider that. Mm-hmm. But the reality is you're going to pay for that kind of expertise, and I don't think most local governments are going to have that. Unless you're really big, that's my take on it. It's more cost effective to hire, regardless of whether you're doing a non-discretionary or discretionary, to do that. Mm-hmm. Unless you're huge and can afford to have a lot of people who that's what they're doing day in, day out. You're talking about a $230 million fund, which I know to us is really big, but it's not really big,
Mm-hmm.
Comparatively. I want to say for the number of people in this fund, it's about $8 million that's being contributed on an annual basis by the city. And in addition to that, because of the pension bonds that were issued to keep this whole, there's another $11 million in debt service that's being paid out. And so the two together is going to be in the range of about $19 million annually, and that's probably about half of what the city is contributing to VRS. And so to go out and hire a committee and make sure you have people on staff with that kind of expertise, I think you're far better to either go discretionary or non-discretionary and
Right.
hire out for that.
And I guess the other thing I was going to mention is, I mean, back in the day, there was a retirement manager, and that's all that person did. Now, you all are spread amongst budget, audit, whatever else comes along. So, I mean, there's a difference there also, as opposed to having one person who is in advisement of all of it.
That retirement manager didn't take care of that aspect of it, though.
Right.
Only thing-
I'm talking about the 1980s.
Oh, you're talking about the 80s. Okay,
Yeah,
way
dear.
back when.
I've been here a lot longer
Okay,
than
you're
you
talking
have.
right before Ray Clark, okay.
Yes,
And Monica
before
Satterwhite.
Ray, Pete Teague, who used to
Probably
be.
before VRS.
Yes, yes.
Let me
before
give you two
VRS.
comparisons on that. In Danville, their pension system was the only pension system they had. It was for all employees, not a part of VRS, and that's exactly how we did it. The advisor took on, and we did do non-discretionary, and they took on the lion's share of the work. One of the things I noted when we get back to the bylaws, and Landon and I were mentioning this, it's a little off topic, but they have the CFO is the custodian, and typically what I've seen is you have an outside third party as a custodian, so that discussion can come up, but that's typically what you have. And the folks that were running in finance, pension was not the only thing they did.
Right.
Now, at one time, I did have one person dedicated to retirement, and they did both sides. They did dealt with the employee coming in saying, I'm thinking about retiring in 3 months. What does it look like? We eventually split that and made it very similar to what you have here. Human resources takes care of the people part. Finance takes care of working with the financial aspect. I think that's a good split, but typically when you have that, the retirement person doesn't have a full-time job. Discretionary, non-discretionary, they just don't have a full-time job. In Roanoke, however, they did have a team, a retirement division. Roanoke was a much larger city with more employees. Theirs too was that was the only pension they had. They didn't have VRS. Where here, you're a little more like a Danville in that this is a closed system. So there's not that many, pretty soon this is going to go away in the not too distant future. So, but Roanoke did have their own team. However, the director of that department did other things other than just pension. So that is just to give you some insight.
Yeah, I just wanted to
Good question. It's a very good
throw
question.
more things out into the mix as far as discussion purposes. Did anybody else have anything else they wanted to say? Do we need to take a vote at this particular point in time?
I just want to make two other quick comments, and then I'm done. I think to Barbara's point, and using VRS as an example, generally the big players in pension world that have multiple $1 billion of assets do non-discretionary. They go out and hire professional investment staff, and they do it themselves. Mm-hmm. Generally, the smaller, under $1 billion, and I'm more talking not public plans, because I think public is a little bit different. But generally, the smaller plans go with the discretionary. Let the professionals do it for you. Mm-hmm. I've from what I've heard, and I don't have empirical evidence on this, but just from what I'm feeling from talking to people is that there's been a trend for the smaller groups to move towards discretionary, but public plans have been a little bit slower to change that relationship for a myriad of reasons that public plans don't want to do discretionary. And then as far as the fees, what Mark mentioned, that the side-by-side of the fee structure. So in either scenario, you have your advisor or your discretionary manager, and then you have the underlying investment managers who are actually picking stocks, the stock pickers. They both get paid, whether the advisor gets paid and the underlying managers get paid. And you have to look at the whole, how much fees you're paying at both levels. You would hope that your goal was the discretionary manager can help you negotiate down the investment manager fees, and on the whole, you're equal or better off under discretionary. And then, if anyone's been following the markets last week, and Monday there was an event and the market went down 7% or 8% in 2 days. If we're on non-discretionary, the board's not going to get together and say, let's move some money to take advantage of this disruption in the market. If we're under discretionary, the manager can say, that's all they're doing is looking at our portfolio, managing money. They might be able to save us 10 basis points, which is not insignificant money when you're talking about.
And the only thing I'm going to differ with there, I agree with what you're saying, but I will tell you that I've worked with non-discretionary that were also able to get us discounts on fees. So it's not just that you have to be with discretionary for that one to happen. And then the other is just investment opinion. But I'm of the opinion I'm not going to time the market. I'm going to tell you in 2008 with my investments, I didn't open them. Because I knew my gut reaction was going to be, oh my goodness, I need to get. Sometimes you have to ride it.
Sure.
But not, so that's more of an opinion thing, and we just have to respectfully disagree, because I have close friends that felt completely different, and they were trying to time the market, and that's a personal thing.
And when I agree with that, I'm not saying timing the market is difficult to do, and these managers would make small moves on the margin. If they're not going to take $200 million and just put it in cash one day and invest it the next day. They're going to move, $1 million here, $1 million there.
But you are right to the point that your discretionary is not going to come back to the board. No time wasted coming back to the board to make those decisions.
They may ride it out and not do anything, but they may decide to do something.
They'll decide. Where with a non-discretionary, they're going to have to get approval. Now, they may have to say we need to call a meeting, we need to have a conference call, whatever. But they're going to lose a little time because they have to get approval.
They're actually put in a position where it's not going to be without question. They're going to still come back to us and explain their decisions. They're just going to be explaining them afterwards instead of asking Mother May I first.
Begging for giving us later or something. But I don't mean quite that way. But to answer your question, I think the decision that needs to be made by the board today is do you want us to go back out and with an RFP? And if you do you want that to be discretionary, non-discretionary, or either or both? Now, I would, again, I see wanting to say give us both options, but I think you want to say either and then compare, because for instance, I know for a fact PFM called and told Alice, we're not going to be responding because we only want to do discretionary. We don't want to do non-discretionary, and then you're going to have other managers that only want to do. So I think my recommendation would be that the board consider going out with an RFP and allowing for a firm to do either one, or if they want to, both.
I agree with that.
Well, let's have a motion then.
Motion to open up the RFP for both or either non-discretionary or discretionary.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay.
We didn't actually go into a close.
No, you didn't.
We just have them out. Yeah,
Because
everything
they're
is
one
still
of the-
being recorded. We just didn't want them to be in here for that discussion.
Right. Because that could give them an in.
Yeah, I thought we were in closed, and I was thinking we had to wait till we came out to make that motion, but
Derek has
appreciate
this
it.
whole page that he reads.
They can go look at the video, I guess.
Right,
Anybody responding, if they want to research and find out that this is available for them on YouTube, can do that. But they all have the opportunity at the same time.
Yes.
Okay. So do we want to go let them back in and then make the vote? Is that what you're saying?
No, she was
Okay.
concerned that we were in a closed session.
Okay.
And
But
you
we're
need to
not.
come out of a closed, but
Right.
we're not.
Right. We're just bowing to the,
I just have a question. Personally, I'm for discretionary. I mean, they're the professionals, they do it every day. We meet once a month. And so 90% of the time, we're gonna take the recommendations anyway. So why would we really, if we're gonna go discretionary, why waste those other people, why waste the time getting both?
I think it's just to make a comparison on the fees and the money that's involved.
On how much it's gonna cost us?
Yeah, I think it's,
And what we get for
Okay.
that.
I think it's
What you
due
get for that
process and
money.
our trustee responsibility.
I mean, we still may end up going in that direction, but at the same time, we've given some of those other firms the opportunity to respond. Is that not the general? All right, should we let our
Absolutely.
visitors come back in and move on to the bylaws status, which is mostly a discussion about the terminology that was used, that was pointed out about the calling it a treasurer in one section, and it's been highlighted, if you all, or calling it the custodian,
Page 2.
page 2 and 3. So,
We have a guest here, I don't know if he's here to speak, or he.
I think he's just here to
He's just
observe.
Okay.
Yeah, I asked him a little earlier.
I didn't want to make him waste all day long. You know, if
I
he's just,
remember when he used to be employed with Parks and Rec,
Oh, yeah? Yeah,
so,
thank you.
because I didn't see his name as being retired, so I was wondering. So is there any discussion? I mean, I do think we need to have consistency one way or the other and make sure that it's fully understood from one part of the bylaws to the next as to what we want to call that particular role.
I believe, to be consistent, I think in the election paragraph on page 3, that the two occurrences of treasurer should be replaced by the same language on the previous page that says fiscal officer / custodian of funds.
Yes,
All
I
right,
think.
does everybody see that, note that, the difference between page 2 and 3 and the recommendation from Mr. Munson? All right, do we want to put that in the form of a motion?
I move that we modify the bylaws to make them internally consistent, replacing the two terms of treasurer under the election paragraph on page 3 with the same language found for the title of the officer on page 2, that being fiscal officer / custodian.
A second.
All right, is there any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. Do we want to move on to C, recommendation to City Council on funding and benefits?
Do you guys have one? Because the idea was we'd come back at this one with any recommendations.
Well, I think we need to probably guide them a little bit in that. And I think in terms of funding, your recommendation want to be that you fund at the full actuarially determined contribution level would be your recommendation on that. On benefits, we are in the process of looking at working with the actuarial to look at what different types of benefit changes in terms of cost of living adjustments would have on the pension fund and things that may be prudent to consider. And I would recommend that we hold this for a future discussion and until we get that information.
Okay, you've heard the recommendation. That doesn't necessarily, I mean, council is still going to discuss it, and council will be the ending vote on it, but her recommendation is that we ask for the full funding based on the actuarial report. And does anybody want to put that in the form of a motion?
Motion.
Okay, so I think the motion would read that the Retirement System Board recommends to council that they fund the pension systems at the full actuarially
EDC.
determined contribution rate.
Okay.
So,
Is there a second?
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
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 None opposed. All right, thank you very much. And then the audit results?
The reason they do not do a presentation to us is because we do not issue our pension information as a separate audit. It's part of the city's audit. It's not a separate system and report, and that's why they do not come and do a presentation.
But do any of the other boards or commissions have a separate?
Yes, EDA and PPIC both have separate,
Okay,
so they do get presentations.
okay.
And the investment, the pension plan in Virginia Beach, they do a presentation over there because they issue a separate set of financials. Because ours is part of the CAFR, that's why they don't
Okay.
come to us.
Well, it's just good to have the explanation then.
well, and I think moving forward, and what she's speaking of, if you look at the city CAFR, the pension fund is going to be in that CAFR and it's audited, but it is part of the city's audit.
Right.
Versus some other funds would have a separate audit and issue their own separate CAFR for the pension. And that's just not the arrangement we have here. I think it would be acceptable, and we actually have an RFP, the city has an RFP out on the street now for auditors. And we could ask when we select one that we understand that you all are part of the city's CAFR, but this board would also like for them to come and discuss that process. So the answer we got was why they haven't done it in the past. We could certainly ask that they do that if this board, if that's the desire of this board.
What do you all think? I mean, the other option, it's presented to city council too, is it not? The other option is for us to, be notified if the board wanted to come to that presentation at a city council meeting or a work session, whichever is done.
I guess I'm kind of in between. I believe if they make any specific recommendations or comments regarding our fund, I would like them to present that to us separately from City Council, because it may not float down to us naturally.
Right.
If there are no specific comments or recommendations regarding our fund, I don't think we need to be briefed, but I think we should ask that if in the course of the city audit something is specific to this fund, that this board...
That you'd like for them to come to this board.
I think we can just use that as a recommendation and not necessarily as a motion.
I don't think you need to take a vote. We just need to duly note it and make sure as things transition, it gets to the appropriate person. So noted.
Okay. Moving on to new business. Briefly, I think you all will find an attachment. The city clerk sent out a note last week asking for attendance, board attendance, And it's as much a part of the issuing of the checks to the retirement board for attendance as just also monitor attendance, if you all want to take a look at that. And actually, there's just 2 of us right now that would agree or disagree with our attendance, since you all are brand new to the board. But just so we're aware that this is now going to be probably an ongoing report to the city clerk's office.
And also, last year, it was May before I got around to processing the checks for the board members. I wanted to be a little more proactive and get it out a little sooner this year. But we do need a vote on if everybody's okay with these checks being issued for a total of $410.
Somebody want to make a motion that those checks be approved?
I move they be approved.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
None opposed. All righty then. Okay, and there's a John Hancock invoice that we need to approve?
3 of them total.
3 of them.
Yes.
Do they need an explanation, or it's all?
I move we pay our bills.
All 3 of them?
Yeah.
Anybody have any questions? Or was there a second yet?
Second.
All right, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
None opposed. All right, gentlemen.
Thank you.
We appreciate you stepping out for a little while. It took us a little longer to discuss our budget. We do appreciate you coming back in and letting us get our quarterly report.
Thank you for having us as always. We enjoy the time we get to spend with you. So we've got our report here, 4th quarter and year 2017 performance evaluation, and we were aware that there are 2 new board members. So what I thought we might do at the outset is just recap the history of our relationship and the things we've done over the last really 12 months, and we'll get into a review of the capital markets from the 4th quarter and for the full year of 2017, and then, as we typically do in these meetings, talk about what our outlook is going forward, because it is quite different for 2018 than what our views were for 2017. And then we'll review portfolio results, both at the total fund level, and then we'll step through some individual manager performance as well. So with that, I'll ask everybody to turn behind tab 1.
Real quickly, did everybody get a chance to meet Mr. Birnbaum and? Okay, Jim? All right.
Great.
Just
Thank you.
checking.
Appreciate that. Thank you. So behind tab 1, the history of our involvement with the Portsmouth Fire and Police and Supplemental Retirement Systems really started back in early 2012 when this team was at Credit Suisse. And our role back at the beginning of the relationship was to oversee and provide due diligence on a single investment manager. And you'll recall that was the Schaefer-Cohen portfolio, which at that point represented about 40% of the overall retirement system's assets. We'll kind of talk about some of the things we did to diversify away from that, but our sole responsibility early on in the relationship was to provide oversight of that portfolio. And the reason we were involved with that was because this pension system was able to access Schaefer-Cohen at a much cheaper rate by going through Credit Suisse than had you gone directly to that investment manager. As the board is aware, we've since the very beginning attended all of the quarterly investment board or retirement board meetings and investment committee meetings, to the extent there were investment committee meetings, providing commentary and oversight on that single portfolio and a broader view of the capital markets as well. In 2016, our team moved from Credit Suisse to where we are today at Greystone, which is part of Morgan Stanley. And just to remind you, Greystone is the institutional consulting arm of Morgan Stanley. And at that point is when I joined the team. So prior to my involvement with Portsmouth, I was head of public pension fund consulting for a firm called Mercer Investments. I've been in this business for 20 some odd years, 24, I think, starting this year. It's hard to believe, but pretty much my entire career has been working with the needs of public retirement system clients. And I know you've talked about this notion of discretionary and non-discretionary mandates. Just to let you know, I've worked in sort of both capacities for very large and mid-sized public and corporate plans. And given my background is why I became involved in this relationship, given the public fund nature of this plan. Jim has always been involved from the beginning. And he and I lead the relationship and the advice that we provide to the board and working with staff on a day-to-day basis. So in late 2016, after sort of Alice got her feet on the ground after having joined, we met with Alice and the board chair about some concerns that had materialized as a result of an independent governance study that was conducted. We shared a lot of those same concerns about the governance practices, and we talked to the board about and the staff about taking on a larger role with Portsmouth. So I mentioned at the beginning we just oversaw a single portfolio. Given my background in particular, we talked about perhaps working in a more formal way across the entire assets of the pension system. We committed to the board and to staff that we could be your partner in addressing a lot of the governance challenges that were identified. And we committed that we would address all of those issues in a period of 12 months. And I'm happy to say, as we've reported over the last couple of quarters, that we've been able to address those challenges that were faced and bring the practices up to best practices across the industry. So what is it that what we did? So what did we do on page 3 really since late 2016 and then ultimately fully implemented in the fall of last year? We restructured, one of the first things we did was to restructure the fixed income portfolio. You'll recall 100% of our fixed income assets were invested in a stable value product with New York Life. We educated the board and talked about the challenges of a stable value fund within the context of a defined benefit plan. The reality is we were able to sell out of those investments, liquidate those investments at a very attractive price, redeploy those assets in a strategy that was much, much more liquid and designed to protect capital in the event of interest rates going up. And we've seen that, particularly at the beginning of this year, that interest rates have started to increase. And when we review performance, you'll see that our fixed income portfolio and restructuring of that fixed income portfolio performed exceptionally well relative to the broad market. We've drafted a new investment policy statement, which is included towards the end of this report. It's been approved and adopted by the board. We started from scratch. We added a lot of roles and responsibilities to the various parties. We talked about in there how we're going to measure success of the plan. We talked about the purpose, risk controls, all those sorts of things, really bringing the investment policy statement up to institutional standards. We've reviewed the plan's liability and cash flow considerations, and in light of that, recommended a new investment strategy for the board. That ultimately was approved in the middle of last year. We took the third quarter to implement that. At the end of the third quarter, we were fully implemented to the new strategy. We'll talk about the results of that and how much better the plan is as a result of the changes that the board had made as a result of that study. That's what the next bullet talks about, just a complete revamp of the asset allocation strategy, broadening diversification, shifting exposures, as we've talked about last year, our views about emerging markets in particular, thinking that those markets and those economies in regions of the world were going to perform better than the U.S. equity markets would in 2017. And in fact, we've seen that view come to fruition. We, as I mentioned earlier, we started looking at this.
Make your computer easier to use.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to get this
right.
all the way down. Thank you.
Make your computer easier to use. Cancel.
Maybe we'll just leave it like it is. I apologize.
Just a few other things. We changed the manner in which total fund results are going to be reviewed, and we'll walk through that. Detailed performance reporting we've rolled out, and this will be the second quarter in which you see that. And I would say, and this is some feedback we've got from some of the previous board members, we really changed the tenor of the board meetings where we not only talk about how the fund has done historically, whether it's over the last quarter or the last year, whatever time period we're talking about, but what are our expectations about the future. And I think for those of you that maybe sit on other boards or have different experiences in working with other consulting firms, what we tend to find is that other consulting firms do a pretty good job of telling you what's happened in the past. We're willing to take a view on what we think the future is going to look like, and you're going to hear from Jim some of our views for 2017 and how those have evolved from what our views in 2018 are. And then lastly, we've addressed all of the governance concerns that were identified in that study. So if you flip the page, I talked about broadening diversification. I talked about when we initially became involved, the Schaefer-Cohen portfolio representing 40% of the assets. I just wanted to show you a before and after picture of where we were and where we got to at the end of the third quarter of 2017 after the new strategy was fully implemented. And the only thing I'll point out is you can see there's a lot more stuff on the right-hand side of that table, a lot more allocations than there were sort of in that middle column. And that's a function of just this broadening of diversification and exposures, reducing reliance on a single manager. Now, one of the things we talk to staff and board about, which is still an issue, is the way that our fee has been paid historically is straight out of the Schaefer-Cohen portfolio. We think it's much more best practice to have our fee, if we're fortunate enough to continue to work with you, or whatever advisor you use, come out of the total fund as opposed to a single portfolio. So that issue continues to be in place. That's how we continue to get paid. We would feel much more comfortable changing the fee relationship to be at the total fund level as opposed to a single portfolio.
So just to add to that for a moment, it's been a very productive year for us. I think the last couple slides illustrate that to you all. And we do want to thank Alice Kelly, the board, the investment committee, because without your support, we wouldn't be able to make the progress we've made in the last 12 months. So just to close on this fee topic for a moment, to go through all of this to get this portfolio to best practices in the industry, this fee issue is the last piece. And when we spoke to Alice about this at the last meeting, our hope, her expectation was that we would resolve this early this year. So it continues to be sort of the last outstanding item. And in keeping with the spirit of moving this to a really an institutional relationship, best practices approach, that's the last outstanding piece for us.
I just want to make one point. I talked to them a little bit before the meeting, and they really are sort of conflicted based on the way that they're paid, because they're only paid based off the assets in that Schaefer-Cohen fund, which they actually cut their fee in half by the reallocation from 40% of the portfolio to 20. So it's just current, and we're going to fix that. We already talked about the RFP earlier, but it's currently not the best arrangement. And I don't know who already at the board level already knows that, but
Well, everybody, it should be crystal clear in everybody's mind that that was the structure. We've talked about it at every meeting.
Okay.
So that there's no surprise there. And nobody beats the drum louder about changing that process than we do. So we're
And I know, even though I've been here a short while, that when Ms. Kelly was here, we certainly had some discussions along that line. And very much like Landon, I think that definitely needs to be fixed. We are looking at the formal RFP process as was mentioned, but I think it would be prudent to consider addressing this issue now, because they are basing it off of a fund as opposed to the whole fund. And
let me just say, add to this discussion, and thank you for bringing that up, Landon. We're a fiduciary to you. We're a fiduciary to the plan participants and beneficiaries. And despite the way that we've been paid, we've always done the right thing. And that's what we've always strived to do. And that's why you've seen us cut that allocation in half. Quite frankly, we'd like to go more, but it's what we...
As a parent, on page 4, you can see that in the fund's best interest, they've done their due diligence, because you went from 40% to 20%,
Yep.
Which impacted them
And
directly.
we always took the view that, we'll get the whole fee thing straightened out at the right time, but it wasn't going to prevent us from doing the right thing. As I mentioned, we'd sort of would have liked to go more. That cutting in half was about all the support we could have gotten from the investment committee and the staff and the board at that point. But as we'll talk about when we go through results, it probably makes sense to do a little bit more culling of that portfolio. So don't rest assured, although there was the potential for a conflict of interest, and we agree given how the compensation scheme worked, there was no real conflict because we did the right thing for the plan and the beneficiaries.
Yeah, just one last point of clarification. When the board agreed to have us take responsibility for all of the assets, at that moment we mentioned this fee issue and we wanted to flip it to a traditional consulting fee. And the response was just do the right thing and we'll get to it.
Yep.
And so and that was a lot of conversation we had with the former CFO, so we just want to make sure that everybody was aware of that.
So the last thing I'll mention in this section is on page 5. I mean, the people that have been on the board and the staff for a while have seen the red light, green light scorecard here. This is what we committed to Alice and Sue early on, as we turn all the red green, and we've done that. There is this one yellow one, this COLA policy, and how we pay cost of living adjustments, whether we do it out of the fund, whether the city takes care of it. That's really out of your control, so it's kind of unfair to even have this there, but it was a part of the study. And so we put it in there. But everything's green. And so, as Jim mentioned, thanks again to Alice, Sue, all your hard work, and the rest of the board in doing the hard work that was necessary to get us from where we were to where we are today. So with that, I'm going to ask Jim to talk about a recap of 2017, talk about our views for 2018, and then I'll pick it back up and talk about results.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you to turn to tab 3 for a moment. And I'm going to go through, we have 4 or 5 slides I just want to spend a few minutes on. But you also have this handout, which I'm not going to go through. I'll leave it for your reading. This was put out by our Global Investment Committee just a few days ago. And it's going to go into it's about a dozen pages, fairly detailed report analysis of what happened in the recent sell-off in the financial markets, 500 points one day, 1,000 points the next day. And so lots of volatility. has a great deal of information here. I encourage you to take a look at it at your leisure. So if you could turn to page 17 behind tab 3 for a moment. I think it's important to refresh what our forecast was for 2017 for just a minute. So back in 2016, we were forecasting double-digit returns for most equity markets around the world, including the U.S. And we took a fair amount of criticism for that bullish view at the time. And the reason for the call was we believed that we were in the middle of, or the beginning stages of a synchronized global expansion that we haven't seen since 2013. So we were convinced that it was going to be a good year for equities. Looking back, it was indeed a terrific year for equities. The U.S. was up, it was an impressive 22%, but that trailed both Europe and the emerging markets which was up 27 and 37% respectively. So I want to make a couple observations about how we incorporate this information into the portfolio construction. What this is not is meant to be a market timing tool. So it is not meant to be this month we're going to overweight emerging markets or Europe. As you all know from participating in our investment committee meetings, the portfolio is constructed based on many factors to come up with the asset allocation that the portfolio has today, including capital market expectations. But what this does do episodically is it gives us an opportunity to shift the portfolio or tilt the portfolio in a direction that we think makes sense to take advantage of our capital market expertise. And if you recall, when we first decided we wanted to reduce our exposure to Schaefer-Cullen premium dividend, which is a defensive way to invest in U.S. equities. The underlying stocks are blue chip companies you've all heard of that have above average dividend yields, and then the portfolio manager sells call options on some of those stocks. So if you look at the income from the dividend and you look at the yield from the call options, that is about 7%. So in a plan like this, you can see how a portfolio strategy like that could make some sense. But our view was we needed to reduce that for a couple of reasons that we've talked about in the past. And so what did we do? We shifted money out of the U.S. into Europe, and we created the fund's first exposure to emerging markets. And so what this information did for us is it buttressed our ability to make the decision to adjust that allocation. So very different than a market timing tool. And we're in a quantifiable business, so we'll be able to measure whether that was a good decision or not. But that's how we use this capital market expertise that we have at Greystone Consulting as part of Morgan Stanley. So we have 50, 60 now analysts around the world that provide us with this information that gives us the confidence to be able to make these decisions. And yes, there's always somebody that can do what we do less expensively. That's I think that's in every business. But I think what matters is measuring the success, the outcome for the plan beneficiaries. And I think to date, in the short time period that we've been at the helm of the portfolio, we've made a difference. And that capital market expertise is something that differentiates us from a lot of our competition. And that's the reason we spend time each meeting talking about it. So it worked well for us last year, but most importantly, I want everybody to know that this isn't used as a market timing tool. We tilt portfolios where we have an opportunity. So as we move into 2018, we're not as bullish as we've been in the past for a couple of reasons. One is we think earnings will probably peak sometime in 2018. The second is financial conditions are likely to tighten. And by that we mean interest rates are likely to continue to go up during the course of the year. It's what you would expect with 4.1% unemployment, and we have a tax cut that will generate additional wage pressure. We started to see that already this year. That's the primary reason the financial markets have been in a state of turmoil since late last week. Although we're still constructive on the markets, we just think you're going to see more volatility. And we're going to go through a few slides that are unusually focused on the short term because of we wanted to make them timely given what's happened in the financial markets. So the one thing we can expect this year is more volatility. And I'm going to show you a slide that just clearly illustrates that we've been in a hibernation as it relates to volatility, and we should expect a more normal volatility type market going forward. So let's go into some of these slides. The next slide on page 18, I just want to reiterate for you all that 2017 was a spectacular year. And what this chart shows is that the return for all major and regional indices and sectors was positive, absent one. You can see the telecom in the U.S. in the red. But if I just draw your attention to the very bottom of the page for a minute, that's the performance of the indices around the world. So the first is the U.S. 22.9. The next one is a world global index, but next to that is emerging markets, which is nearly a 40% return last year. Japan up a little over 25, and Europe up over 27%. There's a lot of discussion about, well, it was a very narrowly focused market last year, and the focus was on technology. And if you look at the technology line at plus 40%, indeed technology provided a great deal of return for investors. But importantly, it was much broader than just technology. Every sector, every industry around the world experienced growth. And this is what we were referring to when we made the forecast of a synchronized global expansion. Next slide, slide 19. This is the volatility slide that I wanted to share with you. So what we're looking at here is a slide going back to 1980, showing the maximum intra-year decline in the market. So what has been the sell-off in the year? And what you can see is last year, the big sell-off we had was 3%. And we've had that only once in history. You can see that goes back to around 1994. But if we look at the average sell-off, it averages around 10%. And this is what I was referring to when our Global Investment Committee said this year, we're going to have more normalized volatility, more normalized sell-offs. So what we experienced, although the numbers were large in the last week, there's nothing unusual about that kind of volatility. That is what we should expect as investors in capital markets. We think, just as an aside, this exceptional low volatility that we had last year, it enticed investors to borrow money, leverage, and invest in stocks, because stocks only go down about 3% in the worst case. And so when we had a sell-off in hedge funds and other strategies that are leveraged, have debt, borrowed money to invest in stocks, as soon as that market starts to sell off and it hits a certain threshold, there's an automatic sell that comes in. And that exacerbates the volatility. So while we don't like to see these sell-offs, they really are healthy for the financial system. Let's look at slide 20 for a moment. And what this slide tells us is that and we've talked about this for some time, we thought earnings would grow last year. And we also thought that the multiple, which is the multiple is the price of investors are willing to pay per dollar of earnings, would also rise. And that's exactly what happened. So this yellow line is earnings, and today we're at $148 a share for forward-looking 12-month earnings per share for the, if you took all of the companies in the S&P 500 and rolled them up to one earnings number, it's $148. And then you see the blue line is the multiple that people are willing to pay for those earnings. And you can see that those have risen now to 18.6 times. So yes, earnings went up, and multiple investors are willing to pay went up. That's a multiple expansion. And this is the definition of good news. And as a result of the rising earnings and rising multiple, that's the reason we had such terrific global stock market performance last year, and in the U.S. in particular. So what this tells us is we don't expect that 18.6 to go up much from here. It's discounting a lot of good news at 18 times earnings relative to history. We do expect the earnings number to go up, but from here, any growth will be primarily driven from earnings and not multiple expansion. On page 21, this is more of a short-term indicator of whether the market is oversold or overbought, and I included it today just because of the volatility we've seen in the last week or so. And really what this is an oscillator that measures the speed and change of price movement in stocks. And it oscillates between 0 and 100. And over 70 is considered overbought, and below 30 is considered oversold. So it's a measure. Look at it as a measure of enthusiasm for the market. And you could see late last year, it was at a point where it exceeded the 1995-1996 period, which was the technology, media, and telecom bubble. So a lot of enthusiasm built in. And what this tells us is you should be expecting some type of correction during the course of the year when you see this much short-term enthusiasm in the market. On page 22, what we're looking at here is retail investors, and we discussed this at our last meeting for a few minutes, have been the missing link in this bull market. And it's been our belief that the bull market would not end until the retail investors started to participate in the equity market. And so what we've been measuring is, I'm going to draw your attention to the right side for just a minute, is bullish sentiment by retail investors. And that's what we're measuring here at the bottom right. So the AAII, American Association of Individual Investors, what we're seeing is that their risk appetite has gone up. They've been becoming more bullish, finally getting more constructive on equities in the U.S., and you could see that last reading, maybe not quite an all-time high, but their enthusiasm for equities is quite high relative to where it's been the last couple of years. Doesn't mean the bull market is over, but it does mean for us that we're probably entering this euphoria stage, which we referred to a year ago, which we think is necessary before a bull market comes to an end. If we look at the evidence now, have they actually invested their money? The retail investors, have they rotated their money into equities? That's what this slide is meant to review on page 23. So here we're looking at something quite similar in terms of the bullishness or bearishness of the retail investor, and that's the yellow line, so it corresponds with the slide on page 22. But now what we're measuring is we're tracking money flows from equity mutual funds and ETFs, net flows, so both those purchases and sales, to see if the retail investor is actually starting to put his or her money into the market. And what this slide illustrates is we really haven't seen it yet, but we've seen a turn. So we're just starting to see the retail investor move into the equity market. And this is after 8 years of strong investment results. So from the retail perspective, still investing in the shadows of the 2008-2009 Great Credit Crisis. And that's why this has been referred to as one of the most hated bull markets in history, because we just haven't seen the retail investor rotate back into equities. And this final slide on page 24 is a historical slide that compares the U.S. versus international developed, and how the current cycle is changing. Everyone loves the U.S. Because it's been a great place to be for the last 8 or 9 years, but these cycles tend to run, here we're referring to U.S. versus Europe, in 7 to 8 year cycles. It's actually similar for currencies. And we show IFA is EFA is basically Europe and Japan. So we've had big underperformance in the 90s, outperformance in the 2000s, and this underperformance lasts for about 8 years. So we think that we're beginning a new cycle, a new change, and it's not just because of the charts. We're also looking at the underlying fundamentals. We're looking at European growth versus the U.S. We're looking at expected change in earnings for U.S. versus Europe as well. So there's some fundamental work that's behind this also. This information, this data, this slide by our Global Investment Committee is evidence of information that gives us the confidence to increase the international allocation for the portfolio. And if we look at where it was before we started, it was about 13%, and today it's about 22%. So nothing incremental about what we're doing. We're here to make money, and we'll move the portfolio where we think we can make money for the plan beneficiaries. Any questions about our outlook forecast? Okay, great. Turn it over to Brian, go through the capital markets.
I'm not going to spend a heck of a lot of time behind tab 2, but it just provides the overview of kind of the general economy during the fourth quarter and for the full year 2017. Economic growth continued to be robust across the globe, and in that, as Jim mentioned in his comments, factored into earnings growth of companies, which ultimately leads to higher stock prices over a long period of time. So from an economic backdrop, pretty strong global expansion. On page 11, we take a quick look at the results of the U.S. equity market. We look at a couple of different indices on page 11. So we finished 2017 on a pretty strong note. The S&P was up about 6.5% just in the fourth quarter alone. That put us up for the full year, up about 22% for large cap U.S. equities. That did better than small cap stocks. The Russell 2000 index is an index of small cap stocks. You can see both in the quarter and for the full year, those stocks lagged. The large cap indices for the quarter generated about half of the return of the S&P, and for the full year, I don't know, about 3/4 or so of the return of the overall S&P, up 15%. So still strong on an absolute basis, but not as strong as large caps were. And as Jim talked about, it was a pretty broad-based market where all sectors of the index were generating strong results. On page 12, we take a look at non-U.S. equity markets. EFA was up a little over 4%, so lagged the U.S. equity market in the fourth quarter, but outperformed for the full year, so up about 25.5%. Now, part of that is a function of stocks in those countries doing better, and part of that return is a function of the U.S. dollar going down during 2017. If you took into account those two differences, the currency accounted for something like 6 or 7% of the return. So without the depreciation of the dollar relative to other developed market currencies, our return probably would have been less than what the U.S. equity market generated. But because we're putting money overseas and then bringing it back to U.S. dollars, we get some of that return as a result. So those two factors combined put us up about 25.5%. As Jim talked about, emerging markets, which is an area that we've been talking to the board about for quite some time, was the best place to be in the global equity markets. They were up almost 38% for 2017. Again, part of that is going to be the currency effect, and part of it is going to be stocks in those regions of the world simply doing better than we did in the U.S. Currency accounted for about 5% in emerging markets. So even if you stripped out that effect, we still were better in those regions of the world than we were in the developed market and in the U.S. So strong equity market returns across the globe, across all sectors, across all regions of the world.
Can I just ask one question?
Yep.
You're still, for 2018, think Europe and emerging markets going to outperform U.S.?
We do, and it's primarily driven by two factors. One is we think corporate earnings growth in those regions of the world will continue to be stronger, and the valuation levels in those markets are cheaper than they are in the U.S. So you can buy effectively higher levels of growth in those regions of the world for less money. And we think over a long period of time that's a good dynamic.
And I think from the target allocation for our policy, I think we already have a pretty high allocation to Europe, and
we have a healthy exposure there. Yeah.
And do we have the ability, and do you guys take a view on currencies to strip out the currency exposure if we want to?
So, sorry.
I need to ask Barbara a question for a second. I'm sorry to interrupt.
Sure.
Can we meet outside real quick?
Okay.
Go ahead.
So we typically leave the hedging or non-hedging a currency decision to the individual managers. That being said, if we wanted to take a view on currencies, we could certainly implement something we haven't up to this point. We think the dollar is likely to continue to come under pressure. And so as a result of that, we would not be advocates of hedging our currency exposure. Now, that's counterintuitive because, generally speaking, when interest rates are higher in this country than they are in other regions of the world, you would expect that currency to do well. But we tend to think inflation is starting to come into the picture in the U.S. in particular, with the jobs report at the end of last week that caused a lot of the volatility that Jim talked about. And we think a lot of the interest rate hikes that are contemplated by the Federal Reserve are already factored into the price of the currency.
And to be specific, on page 17, what we have our opening comments, we talk about that exact question, European equities. So we remain completely unhedged, the currency, if we wanted to get particular about it and control it. And then for Japan, we were hedged last year. We're no longer hedged this year.
So let's move on to total fund results behind tab 4. And I know we've taken a lot of time to get to this, but let's cut to the chase to how we've done in 2017, how we did in the fourth quarter. So behind tab 4 on page 26, this is a snapshot as of year end of the asset allocation of the retirement system. We closed the year at $228.5 million in assets. And that's right in line with the new policies that we put in place and that we phased into in the third quarter of last year. So about 38%, 39% in U.S. equities, about a third of our portfolio in non-U.S. equities, a meaningful portion of that in this Artisan Developing World Fund, which is a dedicated emerging market portfolio. A little bit in REITs, about 20 or 25% in fixed income, and the last piece is this AQR managed futures. So it's a kind of an alternative investment strategy, but a very liquid strategy. We'll talk about an update for January, and the reality is even January is old news now, given what we've experienced in the first part of February, but we'll talk about what's happened since the end of the year. On page 27, here are the total fund results at the end of the year. For the fourth quarter, we were up 2.8%, and this is net of fees, net of all fees. We're up 2.8%. For 2017, we're up 12.5%. So it was a good year for the total fund, returned substantially in excess of the actuarial return assumption. That's important because when we're generating higher levels of return than what the actuaries assume, that means our funded status improves. So that's good for our participants and beneficiaries. Now we show results in relative to a couple of different benchmarks. One is what we call this manager benchmark. So what we do is we take each individual manager that we have in the investment program, and we look at their very style-specific benchmark and roll those benchmarks up to the total fund. So it's based on how much money we have with a particular manager and what that manager's style-specific benchmark is. On that measure of success, things look pretty good. We've outperformed over every single period from the fourth quarter all the way out to 5 years. One of the changes that we've implemented is to take a look at this notion of a policy portfolio. Now, the policy portfolio is constructed very differently than what this manager benchmark portfolio, and it's much more common in the institutional investment world to look at results relative to this policy portfolio. And what this policy portfolio says is, and we'll use our case as an example here, we have a target allocation of 38% to U.S. equities. Now, we have individual managers that make that up, but 38% of our assets is targeted to be invested in the U.S. equity market. And what we say when we calculate that policy portfolio is, what is the broadest representation of the U.S. equity market? Well, in this instance, it's something like the Russell 3000. It represents the prices and returns of all publicly traded stocks in the U.S., or pretty close to all publicly traded stocks in the U.S. So that's how we construct the policy portfolio. We do that for every market in which we invest, whether it's non-U.S. equities, whether it's fixed income, whether it's REITs. We take that broad representation of those markets to calculate a return. And you can see the results there look very different. We've underperformed that metric. And 95% of the reason why we've underperformed that metric is because we've had Schaefer Cullen in this portfolio, and as Jim talked about, Schaefer Cullen is a very defensive manager. It tends not to keep up with a market that's up 20-something%. So that's why we've underperformed this metric. But it's important that we measure that impact. It's important that we look at results relative to this. And it's this metric that drives what we do and the recommendations that we make to the board. We want broad exposure to the asset classes. And we expect our managers in aggregate and the decisions that we make in terms of how we allocate our assets to result in performance that exceeds this benchmark. Now, we've implemented some changes that were completed at the end of the third quarter. So we haven't really been managing against that benchmark because we haven't been in place that long. But we've got a quarter of results. We've underperformed during the fourth quarter, and all the underperformance is coming from that defensive nature of the portfolio. And that's basically what the commentary below this table says. If the Schaefer Cullen portfolio were able to have kept up with the overall equity market in the fourth quarter, we would have only underperformed by 40 basis points instead of 140 basis points. Okay, so that gives you a sense as to the magnitude of the impact that this portfolio has had. And it's a very similar story over longer periods of time as well.
I apologize. I've got to leave at 10:15. Okay. There was some issues that were brought up, and I think we're going to defer them to the next meeting, and also we'll have maybe more of a full board to discuss some things that were brought up. And if there's any policy recommendations, which I'm going to miss, unfortunately, same thing. Okay. And we'll send out the information ahead of time so that the rest of the board can have an opportunity to take a look at it, and there may be an opportunity for the investment committee to also get together and make a recommendation. Okay, terrific. About some of that. But I apologize. Great. I'm making appointments way ahead of time, and I do have to leave. So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm going to add just a little bit of color to this, because I think it's easy to look at this in a vacuum and not have the context of the history. But if you go back in time, it was clear that the investment committee would never have invested in this broad policy that Brian referenced, this Russell 3000 at the time. There was deep concern about losing money. There was an emphasis on preserving capital. There was an emphasis on income. So in part, it's not really fair to go back in history to now apply a benchmark that the committee just would never have approved. And I think it's really important that to understand that point number one. Point number two is that money probably it came from fixed income. And if you look at the capital market returns over the last 5 years for fixed income, Schaefer Cullen may not have been the best allocation decision, but it was dramatically better than the money that was earned in fixed income during that time period. So it was in fairness to the committee at the time that made the decision. We weren't part of it, but we certainly got the historical context. That just would never have happened. And so when you look back in history, I don't know that using Schaefer Cullen at that time was a bad decision relative to how the investment committee felt at the time, because that money would have been in fixed income, and the results would have been much worse.
And the reality is it was a very different financial picture back then, as you know. In 2013, I think it was, we issued some pension obligation bonds to fund the system, and that's why it was, I think a prudent choice at that point is to not take on full levels of market risk by going full boat into equities at that point, because you have the immediate past of whatever the number is, 40% funded before those pension obligation bonds were issued. And so it made a lot of sense to be maybe a little bit more conservative with our investment strategy. But one of the things we reviewed in this asset allocation study that we undertook at the end of 2016 was, look, things are very different today. We're beyond the point at which, there was, a lot of concern about the funded status that we had, and it was a different financial picture, and so we could afford to take more risk. And that's in one of the comments. What I did was we looked at liability and cash flow considerations before we recommended a change in strategy, and that's what really drove the change, is a different financial picture for the pension system and the ability to take on more risk that it hadn't had historically.
So the optics of raising pension bonds and investing in equities and potentially suffering a decline in equities, optics weren't going to be good. And I think the investment committee just took a more cautious approach at the time. I actually don't like this policy benchmark because I think it's an unfair representation of what the investment committee was thinking at the time. And it's incongruent with the thought process. But in full disclosure and fairness, that was an option. And to me, the investment universe was an option. So I think the committee, the board, is being unfairly penalized by looking at this policy portfolio and providing hindsight analysis to how a formally constructed investment committee thought about allocation. I'm hoping that with the newly constructed investment committee, we can get after what the right policy benchmark is. If this group wants to continue to use a defensive strategy, then we should adjust the policy benchmark to reflect that in fairness to the investment committee. And if the markets had been down 10, 15% for the last 3 years, this would look much different. Right? These numbers would be really positive. So, but to me, benchmarking is designed to reflect what it is the investment committee hopes to accomplish, how much risk they want to take, and then let's build a benchmark that measures properly against that. And so this came out of the Davenport study, so we put it in place. But again, I think it's an unfair representation of the prior investment.
It's a tool. It gives a reflection of, if I had done this, this is what it would have been, right. And that's all it is. So I mean, there's nothing bad there. It's just information.
Yep. Page 28, we take a look at some different performance metrics. think this is the second quarter the board is seeing some of this, so it probably deserves some explanation. On the upper left-hand side, it's this chart we call a ratio of cumulative wealth. So it represents the relative, that blue squiggly line is the relative performance of the total fund relative to that policy benchmark. So when it's trending upward, that means our portfolio is beating the policy. When it's trending downward, that means we're underperforming that policy. And over the last 5 years, the ending point is 0.89. Basically, that means we've got 89 cents for every dollar that could have been invested in the policy. It's reflective of the underperformance. It's reflective of the defensive nature of that Schaefer-Cohen portfolio. Right next to it is the risk-return chart over the last 5 years. So this, in a sense, adjusts for the conservative nature of it, of that Schaefer-Cohen portfolio. So we show the policy portfolio, and we show this line, which is representative of, risk-adjusted returns of the market. On the vertical axis is the annualized return over the last 5 years. On the horizontal axis is the volatility of that return. So if you plot on the line, that means you have the same risk-adjusted return as the policy. And effectively, we're right on that line. We happen to be to the left of the policy portfolio, which is reflective of lower levels of risk. And that blue dot is effectively right on the line. So on a risk-adjusted basis, we performed in line with what the overall policy provided. On the bottom left-hand side, quarterly relative returns. So on a quarterly basis, we compare the results going back 5 years to the policy portfolio. You can see there's a lot of red. Again, markets have pretty much gone straight up since coming out of the global financial crisis, so this is what we would expect to see given the defensive nature of that portfolio. And finally, on the bottom right-hand side, where does our return plot relative to the returns of other public retirement systems? The different shadings of blue are reflective of 25% increments. So very top of that chart, the darkest blue would be the top quartile of returns earned by public pension funds. The next one down would be from 25 to 50%. The next one down, 50 to 75, and then the lightest blue, where we plot, would be the bottom 25% of returns. So we plot over the last, 5, 3, and 1 year periods in that bottom quartile of returns. We don't construct a portfolio to beat the average public fund return because we all have different risk tolerances, we all have different liability profiles, we all have different objectives. But again, to your point, Mark, it's information, it's a tool. How do we do relative to others? This is how we do. We would expect to be closer to the midpoint, quite frankly, and you should hold us accountable to that over time. But again, based on kind of the defensive nature of our portfolio, we've plotted near in the bottom quartile. So on page 29 and 30, we take a look at the individual portfolios and how they've done relative to their specific benchmark. First one there, Schaefer-Cohen, we were up 1.2% for the quarter, underperformed the CBOE buy right index. For the full year, we were up 10.5% versus 13% of the benchmark. The reason why we're underperforming that benchmark, or the manager is underperforming that benchmark, Schaefer-Cohen has what's called a value-oriented investment style, and I'll differentiate that between growth stocks. So growth stocks are things like Apple and Amazon that are just growing their earnings off the chart. Value stocks are more, the steady Eddie types of companies, consumer products type companies, Procter & Gamble, things that tend to hold up better when the economy goes down. Those are often referred to as value stocks. Well, value stocks have underperformed growth stocks for a long period of time, and so that's why you see that portfolio lagging the broader CBOE buy right index.
What is the CBOE buy right index?
So the CBOE buy right index.
It's not they don't benchmark themselves against a sort of value bucket.
They don't. So this portfolio, as Jim talked about, buys stocks of blue chip companies, these value steady Eddie type companies, and then they will sell call options that are out of the money on those stocks. So the way it works is if they own a stock, let's pick on, IBM. So they'll buy IBM stocks, and let's say the stock is trading at $100 a share. They'll sell a call option on IBM at $105. And for selling that call option, they'll get a premium. Somebody will pay them for selling that option. Now, if IBM goes up to $105 or $106, they sell the stock at $105. But if it doesn't reach that strike price, they get to keep that premium that somebody pays them. So that's the structure of their portfolio. The CBOE Buy Right Index is an S&P 500 index fund that sells options against it that are out of the money. Very similar to what Schaefer Cullen does, but it's a much broader index. It's a much broader portfolio than simply value stocks. So that's what this benchmark is. One of the big changes we made last year was to put in place an S&P 500 index fund. That's the next return. That's below Schaefer Cullen. It was up right in line with what the overall index provided. They're not trying to beat the market. They're just trying to give us the return, and they did it spot on, 6.5% versus the index. Goldman Sachs is our small cap value manager. They did a nice job in the quarter and for the full year, outperforming for the quarter by about 200 basis points. For the full year, 450 basis points. So they've done a very nice job of beating the market. Rice Hall James is a new manager for us. Before we had exposure to Rice Hall James, we had a Hotchkiss & Wiley mid-cap value fund investment. When we looked at the portfolio and we assumed overall responsibility for the total fund and our exposures, we noted that there was a lot of value-oriented investment styles in the program at that point. And what we lacked was more balanced exposure with growth stocks. So we replaced Hotchkiss & Wiley. We funded this Rice Hall James. It's a growth-oriented investment manager that buys stocks in the small to mid-cap range. It's always good to get off to a good start with a new manager, and we certainly did that with Rice Hall James. They were up over 9% for the fourth quarter, beating the benchmark by about 6.5%. They continue to do really well, by the way. So it was a terrific addition to the investment program here. The next two managers are our developed non-U.S. equity managers. We've had a legacy investment in this American Funds Euro-Pacific Growth Fund. They've done exceptionally well over time. They lagged a little bit in the fourth quarter, but nothing to be overly concerned about. And the new manager that we implemented is this Lazard International Equity Concentrated Portfolio. So they run a much more targeted and concentrated portfolio in developed markets. They have about 25 or 30 stocks. We felt comfortable in giving the recommendation to the board to have this concentrated portfolio because the Euro-Pacific Growth Fund is so broadly diversified. They're holding thousands and thousands of names in that portfolio. So we thought taking a little bit more risk with a concentrated portfolio made sense. And they're off to a good start as well, up 5.2% versus a benchmark of 5%. We do have a bad number on the bottom of page 29. The MSCI Emerging Market Index, I think that the number there, 3.6%, was only for the month of December. The actual return for the quarter was 7.4. So this is a manager that is underperformed, and we'll make the correction, Gail, and then send you the electronic version of that. This is a manager that invests in a lot of sort of these consumer-oriented companies in emerging markets. Could be technology-related companies in China. It could be, quite frankly, technology companies that are domiciled here in the U.S. but sell a lot of their services into places like China and India and Brazil. When you have a market that's up 7.5% in a quarter, it's really, really difficult to keep up with markets that are rising that rapidly. That's what we tend to see. This is a manager we've used for a long period of time. If you looked at their full year results, they're much closer to the overall benchmark, which was up 37, 38%. But the timing of our investment and what was going on in the capital markets in which they invest in the fourth quarter meant they lagged. We don't have any concern whatsoever about this manager. We think they're one of the absolute top managers in the emerging market space. On page 30, we take, so those were the equity managers on page 29. On page 30, we take a look at the fixed income managers and the REITs and the alternative managers. The first three managers there are U.S. fixed income managers, BlackRock, Lord Abbett, and Reams. We consciously structured this portfolio when we got out of that New York Life stable value product to try to capitalize on increasing interest rates in the U.S. So what that means is you want to invest in shorter maturity bonds if you have a view that interest rates go up. Because when interest rates go up, bond prices go down. And the shorter the maturities you're holding, the less they go down. Well, through the end of last year, we actually didn't see much interest rate rises. We've all been talking about this for years and years and years, and interest rates continued to tick lower. They ticked lower in the fourth quarter of last year. Now, that's since reversed itself. We'll show you what the results look like in January, which are dramatically different. But when you invest in shorter maturity bonds, although the prices go down less when interest rates rise, you have a lower yield going into it. And so that's why the aggregation of those three managers, kind of in line with the Barclays Aggregate Index, maybe a little bit of underperformance because we haven't, at least through the end of the fourth quarter, seen that uptick in interest rates. Templeton is a global bond manager, so they invest not only in the U.S., but they invest outside the U.S. in fixed income securities. They had a negative return. They have structured their portfolio to have basically negative interest rate exposure to the U.S. bond market. The fact that we didn't see rates go up means that they underperformed as a result of that. Now, we'll see a very different picture from January when we had a spike in interest rates, but that's what's really driving the underperformance for 2017 and for the last 3 years. For the 5-year period, they've done pretty well. But this is a manager that we think about in concert with the other three managers that we've got. They're part of this overall portfolio construction to capitalize on the view that we have for interest rates in the bond market. Next two managers there are real estate investment trust managers. Principal Global REITs is what it is. They invest in real estate securities, publicly traded real estate securities, both in the U.S. and overseas. They're up about 4.5%. We've implemented an allocation, dedicated allocation to the U.S. REIT market. That was up about 1.5% in the quarter. And the overall U.S. REIT market was up 2%. So the aggregation of those two exceeding what the U.S. REIT market is doing. And then lastly, AQR up about 5%. This is they'll invest in currencies and bonds and equities globally, and they'll move the portfolio around relatively frequently. And they've done a nice job over the last quarter, up 5% versus cash, which was basically flat.
They're quant guys?
They are.
Yeah. They have some sort of proprietary formula where they trade based on a formula, sort of.
That's right. They tend to follow the trends. So when things are moving in one direction, they'll tend to have exposure in that direction. And then when things reverse, it takes them a while. It takes their model to catch up to try to identify what those new trends are. But yes, it's a very quantitative approach, sometimes referred to as black boxes. It's a small allocation for us. It's 2%. We think it's a good diversifier, particularly when equity markets are weak. So let's talk a little bit about January, and we show that on slide 31. So January was another huge month for global equities. In fact, based on Morgan Stanley's view, January's return of, almost 6% for U.S. equities was what we effectively expect for the full year of 2018. So to say that January was strong is an understatement. It was really, really strong. And we were able to participate in those returns. We were up, we estimate, about 3% at the total fund level. It's going to beat some of those manager benchmarks, we think, and then probably lag a little bit given the defensive nature of the Schaefer-Cohen portfolio. We show the individual managers on the bottom of page 31. So Schaefer-Cohen's up about 1.5% versus their index of 1. The S&P 500 index fund right in line, Goldman Sachs in line, Rice Hall James in line. The non-U.S. equity managers, Euro Pacific Growth Fund outperforming, Lazard kind of right in line with the benchmark. Artisan up 6% versus an index up 8%. Again, really difficult to keep up for any active manager in those markets that are so strong. And then moving over to the right-hand side, this is where I mentioned our conscious decision on structuring the fixed income portfolio to try to capitalize on rising interest rates. We saw that in January, and we've seen it in the first part of February. That BlackRock portfolio was down in line with what the overall market. They have a market duration. They have a similar duration or maturity profile as what the index does. But that Lord Abbett and that Reams portfolio both have very short durations. And you can see they went down materially less than what the overall market did. And then you add in that Templeton portfolio, which is trying to profit when interest rates in the U.S. go up, actually generated a positive return. So we still have a view that rates continue to go higher. We think this is a really good portfolio to capitalize on that view. And in fact, in the first part of, or at least in January, and I would suspect in the first part of January, we'd see a very similar result. Pretty good fixed income numbers for us. Yeah, I know we're running in a little long here and losing some folks. Starting on page 33, we have a page on each of the individual manager portfolios, and we look at some quantitative statistics and portfolio characteristics for each portfolio, top 10 securities. It gives you a sense as to the kinds of companies and exposures our managers have. Unless you're interested, I wasn't planning on going through this. We're happy to take questions. If you want to step through these exhibits, I'm happy to do so. I just kind of defer to you on how you want to proceed.
Well, the board's obviously open to do their pleasure. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, I'm sure with Alice's departure and then mine and getting Ann up to speed, we have back-to-back things. So we're going to actually have to leave in about 5 minutes or maybe 10 to attend another meeting, but certainly others are open to do as their pleasure. I'll just throw that out there.
The one thing I guess I'll mention that I neglected to, and it's back on page 31. So I think it was, fortunately, Mr. Waters left. I think it was Gary at one meeting asked us, do you track what we would have done historically had we not made any changes? And my comment at that point was, you know, typically consultants don't do that because it's in the past. What's in the past, I think, quite frankly, I don't know that consultants necessarily want to live with the results that they provide for their clients. But I'm happy to say that the numbers are good for us. So in January, as I mentioned, we were up, you know, pretty strong in equity markets, both in the U.S. and overseas, and in emerging markets in particular. So we ended January with about $233.5 million in assets. So what we've done is say, okay, if we didn't make any of these changes, if we kept 40% in Schaefer-Cullen, if we kept Hotchkiss and Wiley, if we didn't have Rice Hall James and an S&P 500 index fund in our emerging market exposure, what would we have done? We would have about almost $6.5 million less than we do today. So the strategy is working. The strategy is consistent with what our views are for 2018 with, as Jim talked about, with emerging markets and Europe in particular looking a bit more attractive than the U.S. equity markets. So kudos to the board for making those changes. It's worked out. The plan's benefited, the beneficiaries have benefited, and the city's benefited. So with that, I'll see if there are any questions.
Not here.
Great.
Well, I think we've lost a few members. We did go a little longer, but we had a little more business to attend to. So I will remind the board that the next meeting is March 8th. Make sure you have that on your calendars. And I did get a few minutes to converse with Ms. Burton before she left, so I will be in touch with both staff and investment committee on those matters, and that will be brought back to the March 8th meeting. And with that, any comments before adjournment?
Barbara, was there discussion about having an investment committee meeting?
Yes. Yes, there was. And so I'll be in touch with all of it. If there are no comments, then I will adjourn, and we will see you next week.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.